we will be broadcasting on the web starting now. So feel free to start.
Thank you very much. My name is Simon Rawlinson. I'm a partner with the consulting business Arcadis, and this afternoon I'm representing the Construction Industry Council. The Construction Industry Council represents professional bodies, research bodies and specialist business bodies. So that encompasses 25,000 advisory firms and 50,000 professionals operating in the construction industry. I also act as part of the Construction Leadership Council in introducing my platform in terms of off-site manufacture. I'd highlight that the CLC has described off-site manufacture as smart construction. And the reason we do that is that we want to emphasise that there are process elements associated with off-site, particularly around collaboration, which I will return to when we talk about business models. It's the combination of both digital capabilities in design and control of manufacture and the manufacture itself. And of course, we're doing this to deliver certain outcomes, and most of those are around increasing capacity and additional capacity in delivering, for example, of homes and infrastructure.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. My name is Suzannah Nichol. I'm the Chief Executive of an organisation called Build UK. The core of our membership is the contracting supply chain, and we bring together 27 of the largest contractors in construction, some of whom you've seen given evidence over the last week or so, 40 trade bodies which represent over 11,000 specialist contractors which make up that contracting supply chain, about 40% of the construction sector, and they're the ones that actually physically deliver construction out on site. They may also take a role in designing that and also in maintaining it afterwards. We also have in membership client organisations, 15 of the biggest developers who procure or buy from that construction supply chain, and professional services that advise either those clients or those contractors. So we're in a reasonably unique position to have a broad overview from the delivery side of construction, whether it's traditional through to pure off-site or through the manufacturing side at multiple levels, and alongside the CPA and the CIC. We can see the whole picture and ideally piece some of that together as we have no particular vested interest within off-site manufacturing. And so hopefully I think we can add to your information today rather than perhaps repeat what you've heard over the last few weeks.
Okay.
I'm Diane Montgomery. I run the Construction Products Association. We represent the manufacturers and distributors of construction products, and that's everything from materials that are mined from the ground through to the products that build buildings, through to the distributors, the builders merchants that manage the logistics. We're about 87% of that sector by value, so we very much speak for the whole sector. We also, in the same way as Build UK, have a number of trade associations. At the last count, it was about 35 in our membership, which means we have 330,000 people within the umbrella of the organisation and about 23,000 companies. So many very large names that you will have heard of, but an awful lot of SMEs. And our turnover is about 56 billion. So from an off-site manufacturing point of view, we're manufacturers at heart. So we count as manufacturing. Our productivity is aligned to the manufacturing norms rather than construction. And when we have conversations like this, we work very closely with the likes of the MTC and others looking at manufacturing processes, so Lean, Six Sigma, those sort of things, and how we try and feed that into the rest of the construction supply chain. And as Simon alluded to, I sit on the steering group for the work the CLC does in smarter construction and innovation in buildings, looking at really how we get all of this moving forward faster.
Thank you very much indeed. If I might kick off with a question. We've heard a lot of evidence, both written and oral evidence, that says we need to increase we need to have wider uptake of off-site construction. So everybody seems to be signed up to it, the idea of greater off-site construction. So the question is, why is it not happening? What are the blocks from it happening? and how would it affect your own industries that you represent if there was a wider uptake?
I'll kick off, given what I said about manufacturing. There is already quite a lot happening, and I think it very much depends on the view you take of off-site manufacturing. We take a very broad view that it isn't one particular thing. It isn't just pods being craned on or complete units. It can be anything from some really good stuff around precast panels going into roads and bridges that improve the quality, productivity, etc., through to drainage systems on motorways, through to examples you've seen in terms of residential, in terms of complete door systems for fire doors and everything. So a lot is happening where the commercial case makes it very clear. And often that is where it is either incredibly bespoke or incredibly wide-ranging, so it can go into lots of different solutions. And you've heard in your evidence, the construction industry, I've never worked in a manufacturing sector that supplies such a cyclical industry. You've heard all the data about housing fell 70% in the last recession, and for a manufacturing operation to supply into that is incredibly problematic. One of the barriers clearly any manufacturing requires capital investment to get your plant off the ground, and you need a sensible payback. And if you're looking at a pipeline that looks less than 6 months out, and the National Infrastructure Plan is the exception on that, but if you're looking at short-term deliverables without that longer-term vision, how you write a business case to get investment is really problematic. So I think, and we'll talk about it later, trying to move to a slightly more long-term view for construction, and the National Infrastructure Plan is certainly helping that, and also starting to look at a different business model for construction where other sectors partner with their supply chain, and that partnership, I think, is something that will be really important going forward if we really want to see strides in people investing to improve productivity, safety, quality, etc.
I would support Diana that there's actually quite a lot going on, and I think I learnt a new word, componentisation, which is where elements are delivered or manufactured rather than a whole unit. So there's a whole blend of what is called off-site manufacturing or pre-manufactured value. I was out on site last week out at Wembley Park, and they are doing loads of it. So the balconies, for example, were delivered as a unit and just slotted on. The bathroom was delivered as a pod and actually just fitted in. That is off-site manufacturing. The contractor, I had the opportunity to talk to the site manager who said he'd love to do more of it, and he had very clearly what his next bit would be, but he needed to go back to the design stage for the next one and say, you need to do this differently in order for me to bring in. And his was the service cupboards. Really simply, he'd like to literally bolt them together, but he couldn't on this project, but he would be able to do on the next one. Where it's assembled, I think, probably determines whether it's off-site or not in a manufacturing environment. Various elements off-site somewhere and then brought in, or whether a whole unit is brought in and it's the whole blend. We also have to bear in mind a substantial amount of construction work is repair and maintenance. You're about to undergo quite a substantial, or see that up close and personal, over the next few years. And that's a completely different process that people have to think about and probably aren't even looking at off-site manufacture because they see themselves going into repair and maintain. So there's a huge potential where it's not directly applicable in craning things in, but there will be more componentisation. I think the question probably is why isn't it happening at scale and faster? I think there's two overarching answers. Diana's mentioned it has to be commercially viable. No business is going to do something if they can't make the business case for it. And the second reason is the risks are still unknown, or they're not understood, or they're considered to be too great to take that leap of faith from what you know to what you don't know. And that's quite a big step for a business that's doing a big project. If you get it wrong, you're a bit too deep in, you've already made some fundamental decisions. And it's at different levels. There's different issues at different levels, and you'll have heard a lot of them. But to just pick up a few, from the clients, they would have to fundamentally change the way they invest. Their investment decisions are in one supplier or a smaller number of suppliers, and that's quite a risk if we haven't got a mature market. If there's a problem, you've invested in one particular area. If you have a traditional route, you've got lots of other options to deal with. So there's the risk element. There's not a real incentive for many people. It's not necessarily cheaper. They don't know what the right answer is. There's no or very few industry standards, and you'll have heard, I think, from Mark Farmer about that. You buy a kettle, it's got a plug that fits into any house. Construction doesn't quite work like that. There's lots of different ways of installing things, so it's really difficult. There's not a right or a wrong answer. So what one would you choose? There's almost too much choice. And I don't think it's standardisation. I think it's consistency that we're looking for. For instance, when you go and buy a car, you know in this country you will drive on the left-hand side of the road. So you buy your car as a right-hand drive. It's quite simple. You don't have to make a choice about that. I think the other bit is behaviour. The industry is large, it doesn't really trust each other, it doesn't have those deep relationships with its supply chain, and we have to deal with that. We have to build longer term relationships and a more mature market, so when you're making decisions, you've got confidence that the market can deliver all the way through to the end. I think I'll hand over to Simon.
Thank you. And to enable you to go through the agenda, I'll observe on a particular point around the supply chain, and particularly around the off-site modular aspect of the industry. And if you look at that industry, there are probably no more than 6 or 7 large-scale suppliers in the UK. So it's from a scale perspective, there is issue that those businesses effectively have got quite a nice business model without exposing themselves to being a great amount of investment risk. They're quite profitable for those businesses. So the incentive for the supply side to expand at the rate which effectively UK PLC is asking them to do is actually sort of not really there. And if you look at those players, actually very few of them have access to substantial institutional funding to be able to go into that next stage of expansion. So we have a situation where organisations who are probably operating at that level now over the last 15, 20 years, so they're comfortable, they are busy enough to be profitable, and then they're almost asking the question, do we need to expand to maintain our position? So, and on the other side, I think, as has been clearly identified, there's no real signals coming out of the marketplace that there's a big prize for them to go for. So there's a lot of the rhetoric around the prize, but it's not necessarily there in front of them. So I think that relationship between the desire to invest and the clarity of the prize really needs to be broken, that cycle.
Okay, well, thank you very much. We might come back to some of the answers you gave, but let me just go to Lord Renfrew first.
Thank you. Last week we heard from David Hercombe of the N.G. Bailey Group, who rather depressed me by saying it will be outsiders, probably from the Far East and China, who will take things forward in this country. And do you think that business models in the construction industry here need to change in order for off-site manufacture to become more widely used? And if so, how do you think they need to change, and how can that change be brought about?
If I can take that first. The example you were given there was from a specialist contractor, N.G. Bailey, and I think their position in the way which projects are procured and delivered illustrates some of the flaws within the business model which we operate in construction. So typically an organisation such as N.G. Bailey that does most of the detailed design work and indeed introduces a lot of the off-site manufacturing capability, the service cupboards that Suzannah was describing, isn't appointed probably until the project has been let and the financial and programme parameters have been set. Now, there are lots of good reasons for that. There are good reasons around in terms of clients quite like, for example, to use best-of-breed suppliers, so their favourite designers, their favourite engineers, their favourite contractors. So there's, and also, of course, the construction industry relies on competition to demonstrate value. But that idea that we are fragmenting the supply chain and fragmenting the delivery of solutions gets to the heart of the problem. So if we were to look at sort of 3 things which might change that model, The first one is you need to achieve scale of people asking for the same thing. So if NG Bailey is fabricating service cupboards, it wants to be doing it for multiple clients rather than one or two. So they have to have access to a wide range of clients, hopefully delivering a substandard project. So CLC has been developing a concept called a clearinghouse, where you're trying to bring demand from multiple clients. That might be, say, Crossrail 2 tunnel segments, Thames Tiber tunnel segments, bringing that together so that investors have the opportunity to see where they need to build capacity. The second one is around standardisation. So NG Bailey don't compete with another organisation, T. Clark's, to deliver different cupboards. They compete on value and on availability. And the final one is the collaboration model. How do you get clients, designers, contractors and specialists to work together from the start to deliver the best outcome, but one which is demonstrated to deliver value on cost, time and all sorts of elements of performance?
No, you carry on and I'll come later.
Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. The simple answer to that question is the current way we buy and deliver construction is not sustainable. So the simple answer is the business models are not fit for purpose. And we have lots of industry reports. I think if you piled them all up, they'd be taller than me, that tell us that is the case and give us lots of good and very consistent ways of what we need to do. That incentive of it's like everybody holding hands and jumping together hasn't quite happened yet, and it certainly doesn't drive or incentivise more manufacturing, more pre-manufactured value, or more off-site. I think that's quite simple. It's not easy to whole-scale change that, but ultimately that's what needs to happen. And in off-site manufacturing, there's a bit of a vicious circle. We need a change to drive more manufacturing, but you need more of the wins from manufacturing, that better quality, improved health and safety, better programming to come out to drive the change. So it's where do we break that circle? Simon's alluded to some of them, so I won't repeat, but early engagement of the supply chain, and you'll have heard that from others. The knowledge is often in the specialist supply chain. They often have a really good solution or an answer, but they need to be brought in early because it impacts everything else. And if they're not, you then don't get that prize. You build what you're asked to rather than offer something that could deliver the desired outcome. And if your solution is not required, well, you haven't got anywhere else to go and take it, so you actually just revert back to delivering what your purchaser, your client or your contractor wants. So it actually stops the innovation, so the business model doesn't drive that. You'll have seen all the debates about payment going on, the way the industry values itself and how cash flows. Doesn't work for manufacturing. There's high upfront investment required, both in capital investment, but also in actually delivering that product. Yet if you're not paid until that's on site, somebody has to fund that, and at the moment the construction commercial model doesn't fund that, so that is a barrier too. And I think that's probably enough from me, so I'll hand over to you, Dan.
And if I can just add very briefly one piece on, which is because of the model, it's very hard to plan, and the supply chain is really bad at planning. So with manufacturing, we like to set our business plan for a year ahead. We like to know how many panels, bricks or whatever we're going to make. Our supply chain will tell us that they want stuff tomorrow on a pallet for wherever. So the ability to long-term plan, and that comes back to the collaboration and partnership, something that other sectors do that construction doesn't do very well, is to form that long-term relationship so you can share the pipeline of your own investments with your supply chain. And the other piece that is really unhelpful is if that starts, and from the comments from NG Bailey, you absolutely have to involve manufacturing early on to understand what opportunities and products are. But what's very destructive is when it's value engineered out. So a manufacturer may have spent a lot of time and investment developing a product or just upscaling it for a particular project, only to find that it's been value engineered and a copy has been brought in from somewhere else. So there's a real partnership piece that will make the difference.
your answers, which are very good, are obviously exciting people to ask more questions. So can I suggest we keep the answers brief and the questions will be brief too. So I got Lord Valence first, Lord Hunt, and then Lord Griffiths. Lord Valence.
Lord Valence finds it difficult to give brief questions, Chairman, but don't worry, we'll do the best we can. I still don't quite understand this market. I mean, Dr. Montgomery, you said that really there are things happening at two extremes. One is the bespoke big end, which that's one off. And the other is the repetitive end, which is largely, I imagine, housing end. That in housing, you've got a few big players and an absolute multiplicity of small players. The big players like the status quo, because they can make money out of the status quo, there's no need to move from it. But I'm looking for where the disruption comes from. Does it come from the SMEs? And if so, how is it done? Is there some kind of intermediate organisation of scale which does large integrated manufacturing stuff but also can provide architecture, design, engineering and what? A service company that could service a whole host of SMEs. Is that the sort of thing that might break it? Or am I being
for housing, it's a tricky one. I think if we start to look at where you're talking about off-site manufacturing, it would be additional to the volumes we have at the moment in traditional build. Certainly, what we tend to see is a lot of the manufacturers who are our members are investing in taking the components that they make and creating systems. As to whether you'll get one integrator, you've heard evidence from some of those who are starting to do it. The private rental sector clearly has a longer term objective, and I think it's when we start to measure the whole life value of a project, then you start to get to the ability to invest in more than just the initial building. But I think Simon's dying to say something as well.
Well, I think the one example of that disruptor that you might be interested in is Curation, who you might have come across in the United States. Recently been funded with, I think it's 850 million from SoftBank, which is the large disruptive tech investor. Their model is interesting because it is able to disrupt what is actually an even simpler house building industry than the one we have in the UK, which is one which is based on almost site assembly of timber components. So they've brought in an entire manufacturing process to deliver that end to end. So the question then is whether there are clients in the UK who might be able to create the volume in the right form, i.e. volume which is consistent and needs to be delivered quickly, to justify that level of upfront investment. And I'd observe that there are probably large programs, HS2, which might encourage people to invest in certain capacity around repeat components, track bed. And then there are large housing clients, for example, some of the RSLs who are now moving to the scale of the national house builders, who again might be interested in pooling that kind of demand.
And just to hopefully finish off, it comes down to commercially viable, and you're right, why would you change? And I've got 3 very quick examples. One of our members delivers a complete house to site. So on a traditional housing project from one of our other contractors, they've set up a unit. So some of the houses will be traditionally built, as you can visualise. On the others, they prepare a plot, they put the services, and literally the house arrives on the ground floor and the first floor on the back of a lorry and is plug and play. You literally plug it in. And when you look at the houses alongside each other from the outside, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. They are on sale now, and they will estimate to deliver about 2,000 units over the next year. So there's a clear example of where they're doing it. They are manufactured up in the north, so it's actually providing jobs up there, and the house literally goes through a process and comes out the other end. That is available now. You have some other big housing suppliers investing now in off-site facilities themselves. There's a large private house builder which is doing that now, so I think you'll see more of that. And then you've got the example I talked about out on site at Wembley, where those are accommodation units. They're all PRS units, where there is an element of manufacture going in there rather than the complete unit. So I think it is happening, there's pockets of it. It's how we make that more commercially viable and accelerate that so it's delivered at the scale that Simon talked about.
Okay, Lord,
I mean, I noticed that Simon Rawlinson, you work in a company which has a lot of activities worldwide.
Yes.
So, could you comment on the differences or benefits of comparing what the UK does and these other countries? And I mean, I think we were hearing in some of the previous sessions that there seems to be ways of moving ahead faster on the continent than there are here.
I think I've done a specific study which has compared Japan and Germany, and I think the first thing is actually to reflect that when you look at the housing sectors in Japan and Germany, the off-site manufacturing elements aren't necessarily that much larger in terms of the overall value. But what is different is the percentage of manufactured value in those projects, particularly in Japan. Japan is this rather strange market where the land has all of the value and the house is seen as a product which has a defined life cycle of probably no more than 25 years. So the house is more like a car, and indeed it is delivered by the kind of corporations who we would be familiar with as being car manufacturers in the UK. Now, that doesn't mean that they have the capacity, for example, of Toyota to deliver millions of cars, but they do have the capacity to deliver an end-to-end integrated lightweight product that meets that market need, because that's what people want. If we look in Germany, the market is completely different. It's a very regional market, which actually, in terms of the way that off-site manufacture works in the UK, is very similar. So you've got the situation where you've got people who don't have to invest a huge amount of capital because they're only serving a market which might be 200 or 300 miles in radius, but they know they've got lots of people who want to buy those, mainly because a lot of it is self-built. So you've got people who are actually sort of buying a kit product that they're comfortable with. And that's culturally embedded into the way that Europe buys its houses. We don't have that relationship between the house purchaser and what you might describe as the actual delivery organisation that designs and fabricates. So we have intermediaries called house builders, and their preference is for delivering things in a different way. And I think that's how we've got to the situation where we find ourselves, which is, Diana rightly says, is we're now looking at off-site to deliver additionality rather than necessarily the mainstream delivery of, say, for example, offices or houses.
Mr. Chairman, may I play the devil's advocate? From what I've heard, there's this business model and market structure of the construction industry, which is very divided and full of small-scale operations and so on. And it's also an industry which was hammered by the financial crisis. So there's a lack of capital in it. And if you want some company which was an integrator, the essential condition is that it has to have capital. So if you look at the City of London, I mean, it was once divided into small, almost family businesses, which grown up as stockbrokers, jobbers, and so on. And what happened was the foreign banks, American banks, Japanese banks, continental European banks, Swiss banks, came in a major way. They brought capital, and the whole structure changed. And it seems to me, I can't see how in the UK, back to Lord Renfrew's point, we're going to have an integrator short of the government, and I don't think we're looking for that as the integrator, which could do it. So that means, and you mentioned, Lord Renfrew, that if you look at China or some Far East company, I mean, my question at the end is, can we ever have a restructuring of the construction industry in Britain without a major transfer of capital from east to west? Because I can't see how we can do it by ourselves. Because there's no evidence, I mean, frankly, there's no evidence you could show me, because, if I may say so again, I mean, all the evidence you're talking about is, you know, there's this little thing in Watford, and there's this little thing somewhere else, which is wonderful. But in the end, there's no vision for transforming the industry here.
I mean, if I can respond first in terms of getting a vision to transform the entire industry is very difficult for the fragmented reason that you've given there. But I think there are segments and sectors of the industry which are building quite clear visions around how they might do that. And whilst I don't want to use this as the answer, I would reference that the Lords should be aware of the transforming infrastructure performance strategy and the transforming transport infrastructure efficiency strategy, which both focus on creating volume in demand to unlock the investment you've described. I think we know that the UK is actually very good at attracting and applying capital investment, and it generally does that again by responding to pooled demand. So I would not be surprised if we do find ourselves at some point with decent scaled manufacturing capability aligned to the construction industry, but it does need to have a demand signal to actually encourage that investment through. One example of that, and I can't name the housing, the RSL that prompted it, but they have signed up a 5,000 unit deal with a Chinese off-site manufacturing provider to enter in and deliver those over, I think it's 5 years, which is equivalent to a 5 billion investment in cash terms, so it can be done. But the only way is if we start to actually pool demand, and that then will start to unleash the opportunity to invest.
I always find the devil's advocate questions the most interesting and most exciting, aren't they? So thank you very much. And isn't it amazing that despite the industry we have, we deliver some fantastic projects. You only have to look out the window here, and I've cycled here and come past the Tideway project. We deliver fantastic stuff despite the system, I often say, rather than because of it. And that's actually one of our challenges, is the disruptor hasn't happened in a way that has dramatically changed the way the industry performs, the way it behaves and the way it is built. There's 230,000 different companies. About 90% of them have less than 10 employees, so it's built on SMEs. So the industry wants to transform itself. Everybody would like it to transform itself. Our client base is very individual. You could say that about other sectors. We're all individually going in to buy our weekly shop, yet that sector seems to have delivered a different offering. Don't forget the public sector is 40% of our client. And whilst they are individual clients within that 40%, you actually have that opportunity to make some fundamental decisions as the public sector, to buy at scale, to do some of the consistency of demand, to do some of the consistency of design and delivery. So you look at our schools programme, you look at our prisons programme, you look at a lot of the homes, you could actually have a major impact there by pooling that demand and by being really clear on what the ask is, and I think then it will happen. Otherwise, I think the industry will continue to deliver amazing projects, and we have to nudge it and pull it and drive it to be better, because there is a prize for everybody, but there's also a cost.
Okay, Lord Kicker.
Just to build on that, then, what we wanted to explore was how companies in this sector might be encouraged to collaborate more. But if I've understood your answers so far, which have covered much of this ground, really they've either got to be pushed into collaboration, and that may be through government action, if I've understood that correctly, so procurement. Are there other measures, for instance, can there be measures with regard to favourable tax treatment? Would that be acceptable in this industry? Wouldn't it put huge pressure on the already established broad range of small and medium-sized enterprises and undermine their ability to deliver? How should the industry itself come about encouraging coming together and collaborating in this?
Now, briefly, please.
Very briefly. Procurement, I think, is first and foremost. Government is an enormous procurer. Infrastructure is starting to get there. So Simon has mentioned the TIP programme. The Infrastructure Client Group, which is where the major infrastructure clients work collaboratively to understand best practice, have produced the Project 13 that was launched last week or the week before, that starts to really explore the procurement model and how they do that best. And that will start to give scale, and it will start to give programming, because the other thing that is very difficult for the UK manufacturing market, because 80% of the products we use here are made here, so we don't import a lot, and we can't. It's heavier and it's full of air. But the last thing we can afford to do is have the National Infrastructure Plan try and procure all of their projects within a 12-month period, because we physically couldn't deliver it. We don't have the plant, the people, or the capacity to do so. So procurement is enormous. Government has a balanced scorecard. If they used it, it would allow us to have a better view of a real value, both in terms of cost, quality, and environmental impact. So there's a piece around using that balanced scorecard that they've committed to. I think there's a leadership challenge for the sector, and you're hearing from Andrew Wolstenholme in a bit, and I think there's an opportunity for the Construction Leadership Council to now really step up and take that leadership piece on. And certainly the chief execs around my board table of my member companies are aware that they need to, that now is the time that they feel they can step up. Construction is also driven by regulation. I think that is the thing that we need to be very clear. It needs to be consistent. Policy changes are unhelpful. We could mention the zero carbons home target, which changes quite frequently, and I think we might be about to see again. But we can innovate and we can deliver quality products, but you just need to give us a long-term objective, and so we can work to that. So a consistent policy and regulatory framework is really helpful.
Does that include planning? Can the planning system change to force this type of approach?
I'm not sure. From my point of view, planning isn't the issue that we're talking about today. I think planning has a whole host of other issues around it, but I don't think that's the thing that is stopping collaborative partnership in delivering the building and running the building. And I think that's the piece.
I think planning has a role to play, but I think it's one of the levers. In answer to the very specific question, I think we have a big role to play here. Industry bodies have often worked in one direction for their members as lobbying. Actually, part of ours is to show some real leadership and to say, let's stop talking about this. If we really want the revolution to happen, if you want a better industry and this is the prize, this is the direction we need to go in.
And how will that happen?
I think it's starting to happen. I think the fact that the three of us are sitting here and work very clearly and have what we're good at and work between us. The construction sector deal is a real demonstration of the whole industry coming together. So you will start to see our business plans aligned behind that sector deal and delivering the outcomes in that. We've got the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund, and certainly we will be saying to all of our members, stop doing research, R&D on tiny scales individually. This is where the action is. If we're going to do some R&D, we do it together, and we then benefit collectively and collaboratively from the outcome. So it's about us showing leadership, and it's no longer about nice things to do and guidance and information. It's about saying, if you want a transformed industry, if you want a business in the future, this is where we are heading, and enough of them following, because then the rest of the industry is really good at responding in a crisis. We've seen that over the last 12 months. There is a catalyst for change, and it has the opportunity. It needs that direction and leadership.
I can just make a very quick observation about unintended consequences of things which we do with the best intentions. One example of that will be frameworks. So we establish frameworks, and quite often that then constrains the kind of answer that the industry gives to you. So if you have a framework which encourages people to design things before they then buy them and then manufacture them, you get answers which are based on people first designing and then bidding them. So actually designing frameworks to bring off-site manufacture to the front of the thinking, to the front of the procurement, would be a positive act which clients and their advisors, lawyers, cost consultants like my organisation can do to actually move things forward.
Lord Mayor, you want to...
Well, Chairman, I'm in a sense jumping to the last question, but I think it's very relevant.
No, go ahead,
to what's
do
been
that.
said.
Take your question now.
This is all, what you said makes absolutely perfect sense about collaboration and about new models and new ways of doing things. But the real challenge is, how do you persuade clients, not necessarily government, actually government too probably, but how do you actually get a client who's thinking about a new piece of infrastructure to take on board everything you've been saying? I mean, we can say all these things about the importance of collaboration, and the excellent work done by the CLC is pointing the way forward. But if you're a client setting out with a new piece of infrastructure in mind, how is that client persuaded?
If I can use an example of work which we're doing as an organisation. So we're a consulting organisation, and we have teamed up with one or two specialist off-site manufacturers. So what we're trying to do is, before you get into a procurement activity, you are trying to demonstrate that it can be done and that the solution relates directly to that client's particular needs. So you give people the confidence that the solution, they see it right from the start, they see it meets their needs, and they start to understand the kind of constraints and decisions that they need to make. And I think one of the problems that the industry has at times is that we do have this a little bit like a Russian doll. You take one stage and the next stage and the next stage, and you never get the answer right from the start. So I think helping clients understand the full implications and see what it looks like at an early stage makes a great difference.
And to reinforce that, I'll never forget Sir Michael Latham, who actually said everyone must have prizes. And that has to be the win for the client. And I think we need to be better and clearer about what the win is and what the win isn't if you don't go down that route. So you get to a point where, why wouldn't you do it this way? And I think it's a bit like, at the moment, if you wanted to know where to go somewhere out on a London street, you don't get your A to Z out, you get your phone out. And we have to move from there, we have to move from where we are, the A to Z, to the getting your maps out, and the client sees that as an automatic, why wouldn't I do it that way? Why am I still doing it this way?
So are you saying it's only the uninformed clients that are not adopting off-site manufacture?
No, I think it's that we haven't quite tipped the risk a bit. So I was with a very, very educated client last week who is just saying at the moment, the risk, explaining to his investors, because it's a client is only one part in the chain, explaining to his investors that he's going from something he knows that he understands that may have problems, but it's problems I know, to a leap to here. There just isn't enough of a win at the moment. Nobody's quite felt that win to say, oh, you're still doing it the old way. And that's the bit we keep talking about it. We're not actually able to nudge everybody or enough people over in to say, well, why wouldn't you do it this way? And you come back to the homes I talked about, where they're delivered on site. You need a few people to say, I waited 10 weeks for my home and it's fantastic. Why would you go down the traditional route and wait for 3, 4, 5 months for a home that then has lots of problems with it, when you could have one in 10 weeks? You could actually have one in 2 weeks. You could get married, order your house, go on honeymoon, come back and your house is waiting for you. What's not to like about that?
Lord Mayor, do you want to come back?
Well,
back to the honeymoon bit.
I'd like to come back on one point. That's housing, and that point's fully understood. But how do you think infrastructure differs from buildings and particularly housing?
I think it does, but in some ways infrastructure is the most developed. So a lot of infrastructure is already done off-site, and we'll certainly see with things like HS2, and we've seen with Thames Tideway, the opportunities to do stuff off-site and bring it on-site hugely minimises the impact on the local communities and on the project as a whole. So I would actually say infrastructure is really leading on off-site manufacturing. It perhaps isn't the image that's seen of it, but a lot of it is actually done. And I think one of the pieces that we've been working on through the work on the CLC group on this is also making sure that we have shared metrics so we all understand we're talking about the same thing, so in terms of productivity, safety, quality. And then it's about making sure all the projects share that information. So when you're starting, if you're a client starting to think of a project, you actually start to see that, why wouldn't you go there and understand those metrics? So I'd say infrastructure at the moment are the stars probably, but having said that, it's about sharing common metrics, and it's the old adage about what gets measured gets done, and certainly measuring and finding common languages to understand the success of a project, not just at the point of construction, but for me the most important thing is through the life cycle of the project, and that's what we're not very good at doing at the moment, is measuring that whole life cycle.
Okay. So we were sort of jumping to question 5, have we? But,
No, you take your question now.
I'll take my question now on 4. So what types of skills are needed to facilitate a move to off-site manufacture, and how are these differ from traditional construction skills? And I would also add, what is the differences between what we're doing in the UK and particularly on the continent? You've given us a little bit about what happens in Germany, but it does seem to me, how is the training also different between here and on the continent? And is there something we could learn more?
I'm not going to be able to answer specifically about the professional training, for example, on the continent, but I'm going to make 2 observations. The first about particularly the role of the professions in the UK and to some extent clients, which is, I think there's a really important role in upskilling the gatekeepers, the people who have the first contact with the client, whether that's a lawyer, whether that's a consultant, who shapes their thinking at the earliest stages. And even if that's just to keep the option open, the thinking alive, so that when that client meets, for example, an inspirational contractor, that they're receptive to somebody coming up with an innovative idea that says, we could do this way. And I think the industry too often closes options down because people like to sort of lead with their own solutions. We tend to be a solution-driven organisation rather than an outcome-driven industry. So that would be my particular ask on skills. If I was to reflect on another difference between the UK and continental Europe, and reflecting on many of the organisations who deliver particularly large-scale infrastructure, the Vansies, the Hochtiefs of these worlds, they typically own and operate these assets, and so that it's actually in their interests to be able to sort of maximise value throughout the entire life cycle. So that gives them a very different perspective around, again, how they specify and design these things.
Does the UK government impress upon people that we should look to see what's happening elsewhere?
I think that there was a great piece of work which was done in 2010 by the IPA, which was looking at a whole lot of expertise from around the world about how we could take and improve value in the delivery of infrastructure, and I think a lot of those lessons were learned. I think we then need to reflect on the fact that there are certain constraints on the way that we operate infrastructure. We don't run highways on tolls, for example, so we don't have the same ownership interest that, for example, Vinci might have in France. But I think there's quite a lot of openness and interchange between what is done in Europe and what is done in the UK, simply on the basis of co-ownership of many of the contracting and engineering consulting organisations that operate in this market.
That's interesting.
Some there seems to be a lack of marketing and sales. That if you're going to really get clients to buy into this, then you need good marketing, good sales. There's a good sales pitch there if you can put it across. I mean, where would the marketing and sales be located in the supply chain? And would they be the ones who get the benefit from
it? And it's a really interesting question, because I guess what I would think is, are we actually trying to sell off-site manufacturing, or are we just trying to sell improvements in productivity? And this goes back to where the CLC came down on, we use smarter construction, because it isn't just about off-site, it's about doing stuff on-site better as well. So using robotics, using GPS, using drones, so it's the whole gamut. And certainly digitising the sector, we must be one of the last sectors to digitise. So we now have BIM level 2 mandated by government. That really moved things on, but it's how we continue to move that through. And that will start to integrate the supply chain. If you have a fully BIM functional project, right from design and inception through, lots of benefits in terms of payment, lack of substitution, being able to manage that whole project. And the payoffs will be around improving productivity. So I don't think there is one component in the supply chain who'll become the salesperson for the whole thing. I think as you start to move to that more integrated model that will be driven by digitisation and driven by the need to improve productivity, because ultimately we don't have the people or capital to do it as unproductively as we are, you will then start to effectively get your own salesman. But having said that, and it goes back to Lord Mayor's question about infrastructure, the examples in infrastructure like Thames Tideway, Crossrail, and indeed the Olympics are real exemplars of the industry really integrating and delivering something that is substantially better than it would have done by any other means. So we have got good examples. We just need to be better at talking about them and moving on to the next one.
Can I just follow up a little bit more? Because, I mean, the Olympics is a big one-off. There's all sorts of interesting things. I'm still back to this business of, how do you convert clients? Because that's one of the blockages, is how do you get them on board? And somebody's got to be responsible for that. And I'm still back to, who does it?
So I think going back to, I suppose, the first point of engagement, typically the influencing and shaping of how we might do things is either quite often by a project manager or an architect. And you could say that they are often the best advertisers and marketers in the industry because they are very good at communicating images and great outcomes. So then there's the issue of aligning the interests of that designer with that solution. And I think you've met one or two businesses who are very good at that and who've differentiated themselves by being able to show that they're aligned to a new way of working. And I think we will start to see that there's a greater recognition that actually delivering on a product basis, greater quality, actually has its own inherent value. And one thing that I continually reflect on, if one compares to where we are now, say to 20 years ago, the things that are probably the greatest quality we see in our lives are the iPhones that we carry, the beautiful computers we have, and the watches. It's all, we're now in a productised world, and we probably need to celebrate that more than a sort of architectural and building world, and that, I think, would send a very positive message.
Just to sum up on that, it's almost off-site may not always be the answer. Our client members tell us they want buildings that work as anticipated, to the high standard, to the required quality, and they're delivered in accordance with the agreed cost and programme. Now, off-site or manufactured is often a solution to one or part of that, but it's not necessarily the only answer. So it's not about saying to clients, this is the only answer. It's about the industry saying there has to be a smarter way of delivering it. And a bit like in many other industries, you can use it. We're often, people use the car industry. We don't make cars one by one and hope that we used to do that and it didn't go very well. So it's about the industry saying, this is what we offer, not what you want. And actually, so part of it is about the industry taking responsibility as well. So it's more of a not just selling to clients, it's about that's the best thing on offer. Again, liken it to when you go and buy something, you don't go in and specify what tin of baked beans you want. Those are what's on offer, which actually works best for you to the required standard. It's met quality specifications, and there is a system to buy it. You don't go in and have them handmade every single time. And the industry needs to take a look at itself and say, how do we offer something that is smarter? So it's back to that breaking the circle, which comes first, buying it or providing it. And we have to break that loop.
So can I just ask you, perhaps we've covered this before, but the role of the government, Lord Mayor, I still don't quite understand. When a new project, instead of new prisons or whatever, does the government sort of say, we want to have a certain percentage of this is used by off-site manufacturing, or do they, in what way does the government, as it were, or the government agencies, and which government agencies, as it were, are demanding higher standards and efficiency? It's not building research establishment. Is it which ministry does it, or are these kind of objectives come down from each government department as they're building each little thing?
A number of government departments have a presumption in favour of off-site manufacturing. So for schools and hospitals, that presumption is there.
What does it mean, a presumption? And what is the percentage outcome of that?
I think that's a very good question, and I think there is what's called a presumption in favour. There is a balanced scorecard where things are supposed to be procured, but there is a big gulf between what is said and what is actually
done.
What
is the number then? What number do we get now in terms of output?
The criteria is subject to a value for money measure, and it isn't applied until 2019. So there's an element of the departments building up the skills to be able to do this. So I think because you imagine they're going.
We heard
a
lot about prisons
start.
before, but we never got a number.
No.
So what sort of?
I don't think anybody's actually said so. But
the GLA, I'm fairly certain you need to go back and speak to Mark Farmer. He may have raised it. I think the GLA do. A really simple example: on 3 hospitals, the same roofing contractor is delivering 3 different roofs on 3 hospitals, all procured by the public sector. So he would sit here and say, "You want me to look at manufacturing that in a different way, maybe it's off-site, maybe it's more components. You want me to get better at delivering that, but each hospital has a completely different design, completely different roof." So the same people, you talked about skills, we are doing a different job 3 times, whereas if it had been some kind of off-site solution or specified solution, by the time of doing the 3rd one, we're rocking and rolling through delivering that. Instead, it's a whole new game for everybody out on site.
And what did the government say while this was happening? Were they monitoring this process, or saying, "My goodness me, why don't you get together"? Or?
I think that illustrates a great challenge, because there, of course, we know that sort of health trusts are devolved. So actually, the ability of, say, for example, the Department of Health to influence, compared to the ability of the Ministry of Justice, which directly builds prisons, is a little bit limited. So I think that's some of the challenges which the government clients face. And they also have to percolate these skills down into their organisation. So they
might do this.
Well, we start with you've got the Treasury and IPA.
No, who do you suggest should do this?
Well, I would 3 groups of clients. I would have government, public sector, using the equivalent to the mandate for the BIM level 2, which is saying we're going to test people against whether they have bought a certain level of off-site manufacture. I'd want the city authorities to start getting the people who operate within their regions, housing organisations, for example, to start pooling their work. And you'd want to see the large house builders in the quasi-public sector, particularly the RSLs, to start doing that.
That doesn't deal with the problem that in the public sector, if you're building the same building in 3 different locations, a hospital, you'll have 3 different roofs. So ultimately, what would you say to a government about really kick-starting this and giving it huge impetus?
Do you want me to take that as well?
Yeah,
I think that so the first element is you standardise what you can standardise. So there's a very good example from Procure 22, I think it was, which is the contractors came together and developed a standard, effectively a ward unit, so that rather than having lots of hospitals with lots of different wards, they all had the same one, so everybody could start to minimise their design effort. So it might still be built in situ, but it was a common component. Now, you can do those, and you might not be able to do the roof the same because of planning constraint. So find the things that are common, and then focus on those.
Why don't you just straight out say that you would like to see all government procurement be off-site construction? Why don't you just say that?
Because the example might be, again, the law of unintentional consequences, that you get actually sub-optimal optimal results, or there isn't enough capacity, or you just get the wrong product. So what you want people to do is you want to specify intelligently. And some of the evidence you've been provided around platform-based design and delivery, where people bring together components, which creates flexibility and the ability to scale quickly, would be a more intelligent approach rather than just saying we want everything to be done off-site. You need that blend. So it's an intelligent response from clients, consultants, contractors and specialists to improve productivity and improve the quality of outcomes. That's really what we're about.
I think there is also a very clear role for the industry here, and we've got the opportunity under things like the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund and use of the Manufacturing Technology Centre. what is a really good outcome? It's not just about specification. That's a big part of it, and I completely agree about unintended consequences. And we did a lot on the schools programme, where we had more consistent schools, but then that falls away when different people are allowed to ask for it. So you can have individual schools no longer have to follow those requirements. So I think the industry needs to be stronger and stand up and say, this is the better outcome for you. This is the right answer to your question. This is what a good school looks like, and finding the way where you don't stifle innovation, but you are delivering really good outcomes. But that's really difficult when a client says, I don't want that. I want my school to be individual to me or individual to my local area, even if it's not the right decision.
Final brief question from Lord Mayor, and a brief answer, and then I close the session.
I think what we're really focusing on is this phrase, a presumption in favour of.
Yeah.
So when the government says, 5 government departments have said that there will be a presumption in favour of, there's a caveat attached to that, really, isn't there?
So I think
Ms. Montgomery, you used the phrase.
Yes, and it's merely quoted. I think this comes back to needing to do what is said. The best example we've talked about several times is mandating BIM level 2 means that all projects have started to move towards BIM, both in public and private sector. So the government has the ability, by saying it has a presumption in favour of off-site, it will use a balanced scorecard to procure, so it starts to procure against whole life, to procure better quality buildings. I think, as Simon said, it is not about prescribing that it has to be completely modular off-site. It's about defining, and the balanced scorecard does that very well, what good value, highly productive, safe, lower carbon buildings look like, and then allowing the industry to innovate to deliver that. So I think BIM is the best example. The next piece is asking government is actually then taking the balanced scorecard and the presumption in favour of off-site, and I'd rather it was smarter construction than off-site, because that starts to build in all the technology, and then asking government departments to report about how they're procuring against that. It's the old adage of what gets measured gets done.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed. Yeah, I'll let it go a little longer than I should have, but thank you indeed. We turn off the recording now while we change the witness.
The proceeding is currently suspended. 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 The proceeding is currently
Good afternoon, Mr. Wolstenholme, and thank you very much for coming to help us with this inquiry today. Before we start, if you don't mind saying who you are for the record and what your current position is, and if you wanted to say anything to start with, please do so, otherwise I'll go straight into the questions.
Yes. Well, first of all, Chairman, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to come here today.
Thank you for coming.
I find myself in a curious position because as of now I don't have a position. A month
Can
ago,
I have your name for the record?
Yes. So Andrew Wolstenholme, the ex-Chief Executive of Crossrail, and I'm about to take up the Group Managing Director role of Marine and Land for BAE Systems. So a slight shift in sectorial balance. But I'm very pleased, and if I may just for a moment, I've just come from the Department of Innovation, Energy and Skills to get an update on something that is extremely exciting and will act as a catalyst to much of what we've been talking about, is the construction sector deal. If I may, and apologies if it isn't my position to do so, it is a slight frustration that this sector deal has not yet been announced. And over the course of this questioning, I'd like to tell you a little bit about some of the three elements of this sector deal. The central one is an industry-led innovation program at which manufacturing sits at its heart. And coming just a few moments before the end, hearing some of the debate and dialogue going on. This is a very, very important strand of UK PLC. Infrastructure construction represents around 8% of UK's GDP. We represent somewhere around 10% of the employment opportunities. And for rather too long now, this sector has not attracted the sort of debates that we're having here today. So can I thank you for the opportunity? And I think over the course of the questioning, there are very many points I'd like to take out in a very positive, constructive nature.
Well, thank you very much. You are very much our key witness in lots of ways. But if I might start to what you just now stated, do you have any idea when the sector deal is likely to come out and published?
Well, I know that it has been signed off by all the respective stakeholder groups. I suspect, unfortunately, it has, I know, got stuck because Judith Hackett is going to issue her report soon around the tragedy this time last year in North Kensington. I also know that it got stuck because of the inconvenience of the activities around Carillion's failure. All I would say is that we can't wait too much longer for this important sector deal to come out. There will always, I suppose, in politics be a reason why you shouldn't push the boat out a bit. But if there's any help or support that this committee can give, then I would very much like an approach.
What support do you think this committee can give to expedite that process?
My expertise is not bringing a statute to sort of the start line, as it were, but whatever we need to do within Bays to convince them that now is the right time to deliver the sector deal. If anyone can influence that around the table, if it isn't my position in this committee to do so, I apologise. But we need this thing to be out, because in many ways it is the catalyst that is going to unlock much of the intent of the opportunity to go down much more of a manufacturing route.
Okay, so let me come to a different question. It is correct that you just currently lead the Council on Construction. I might have got the wrong terminology. Is that correct?
I'm the co-chair of the Construction Leadership Council.
Right. We're told that this Leadership Council is extremely crucial to encourage wider use of off-site construction, and that it needs to take the responsibility because it has the authority and to drive this process. Is that correct? And if it is, how do you intend to do that?
Well, I was asked about 2 years ago by David Higgins, Mr. David Higgins, who was the then chairman of the Construction Leadership Council, to take over the co-chair role. I suppose if you look at my background, I've been in the large major program sector for about 30 years right now. Originally as a consultant with a group called Ovarap, then with the airport operator in those days known as BAA, and subsequently for Crossrail. And in each of those occasions I spent about 7 years looking at infrastructure and critical assets from different sort of directions. What this sector has, I think, lacked is a very simple and compulsive agenda with a very strong business case that goes with it. I asked actually a private consultancy to help put the sort of numbers together. And if you look at those sort of simple facts, here is a sector that represents around 8% of GDP, 10% of employment. If you look at the pipeline of critical assets ahead, we have somewhere between 450 and 550 billion pounds. And the analysis that was done is that on our current levels of production and productivity, we will be somewhere between 20 and 25% short of resources or raw productive output. So the start point from the CLC was to put forward this thesis that unless the sector came together around a compelling and simple agenda that could attract the attention of a very diverse sector and very diverse industry against one set of one set of initiatives, then we would, like many others previously, sort of fail to get critical change across the different sectors. And the sectors, as you've learned, represents house building into private commercial developments, into public sector, social and economic infrastructures. This is a huge opportunity. And the question is for this sector, what is it that brings the sort of common denominators together? And so what we did is we went out to a sort of leadership group, and the individuals who were represented here a moment ago, some of them helped me do this, to try and get the three strands. And I looked first at automotive, and secondly at aerospace. Aerospace has attracted £4.5 billion of match funding from government over the last 10 years. And the two things that aerospace have focused on is wings and engines. Actually, we do not make complete aircraft here. The two things that the automotive industry are focusing on right now is driverless and battery. In other words, power plants beyond those carbon dependent. So I asked myself the question, what are the wings and engines of this sector? What are the three things that make it very simple that everyone, from a house builder to someone building a school or a hospital or a major program like Crossrail, can hang on to? And the three strands were the definition of the outcomes at the front, so using digital technologies in order to develop better, more certain outcomes. A car, for instance, has a digital model that is 98% mature before you start manufacturing possibly 10,000. A building's digital model is probably less than 60% mature before we start building. So it is absolutely vital that you get the definition and the outcomes understood before you start what we traditionally call build. That gives you two opportunities. The first opportunity is to improve the productivity of delivering the asset, and that may take 2, 3, 4 years. From Crossrail, it's taken about 8 years. There's a huge opportunity to improve productivity. And why do we want to improve productivity? One, because it brings that asset to market quicker. Secondly, because it relies less on resources that, for instance, we are currently importing from Eastern Europe. I suspect there'll be less of them in the future, certainly post-Brexit. And thirdly, it puts those jobs, instead of constructing on site by importing those skills, it provides high-value manufacturing jobs in the areas where jobs are needed most. So the opportunity through digitalisation is to improve productivity, manufacturing of which is part of, and I'll give you some very good examples. And the third opportunity, and I'm going to point to Lord Robert Mayor here, the fantastic work that he's done at Cambridge University, and forgive me, Robert, for introducing any conflicts here, is the opportunity to understand how that asset behaves over its entire life cycle. You know, Bombardier Technologies have actually got a train set on Crossrail that pretty much diagnoses and self-analyses on an hour-by-hour basis the state of that infrastructure. Rolls-Royce down the road in Derby also incidentally know exactly what their engines are doing hour by hour. And unless you digitalise at the front end, you lose the opportunity, one, to improve productivity through the delivery, secondly, to introduce smart technologies and monitoring and data sets to the life of that asset. And I think in infrastructure and building, we have missed the opportunity to deliver both of those, principally because of the slow uptake of digital technologies at the front end. And so the sector deal is about three things: better, more certain outcomes through the delivery of digital technologies, improved productivity by the introduction of manufacturing, and improve life cycle performance by the introductions of smart technologies, including sensor technologies. All of these are available, and I think we are at the forefront of a potential revolution that can take us back into a leading role, not only here nationally, but also internationally across the different marketplaces there are post-Brexit.
So what stage is UK, what state is UK in at the digitisation of construction industry?
Well, it may come as a bit of a surprise to actually learn that we're not badly placed. The government has done a very good job in promoting what's called BIM, which is Building Information Management. It's probably the wrong word, but it's gained some traction, so it's here to stay. I call these sort of digital technologies. It is mandated at BIM level 2 that public sector programs use this. And actually, if I go round, and I haven't done much international travel, I've had my head down on Crossrail for the last 7 years, then that is the envy of many other nations. I mean, America, for instance, that have states of technology that are much better advanced, but the inability to deploy them on programs. Actually, what we're very good here, even though we rock ourselves quite often, is working collaboratively across projects to make sure that the technology is spread across all the different departments. If you only have 10% of the project using the same technology, you're going to get probably 10 different interfaces. If you have, as they do in the car industry, one model that represents the concept design of that car, and it also goes right the way down to looking at what rivets you use and how the different componentry comes together, that is the environment within which you have the opportunity to go and manufacture. And on my time at Crossrail, on my time at Terminal 5, we've been promoting the collaborative way of working in order to make sure that there is the opportunity for the digital model to speak one single language across the whole of that opportunity. And where you have that, you then have the opportunity to talk about manufacturing.
Thank you very much. Lord Griffiths.
Suzannah, it's a great pleasure to ask you questions. You've described yourself as a revolutionary.
I have.
Yes. You said you were leading this revolution, or one of the people leading this revolution.
There have been many others in this room, I'm sure.
Which is terrific news. I really have two questions. The first is because of what you said at the beginning. I can see the case for the sector deal being spelled out as soon as possible.
Yeah.
Where do you think the capital to support it will come from? That's one question. The second question is, a lot of the evidence we've taken is to do with buildings going up.
Yes.
Whereas you've been at the horizontal level. And what do you feel you've learned from that about modular construction, which might be relevant to us?
Yes. Well, let me start with that one, because I was anticipating something along those lines. If you think of what we've done on Crossrail, I started when the programme was 4% complete. We're now 93% complete, and it will open in December, and it will transform London. 42 kilometres of bored tunnel have been done completely through a manufacturing process. So there's no need to worry about certain elements of this. And I say manufacturing, actually, this is not off-site manufacturing, this is on-site manufacturing, because a tunnel boring machine only has two roles to play. It takes away around 6.5 million cubic metres of clay, and it replaces it by off-site manufactured concrete segments. And it does this with a team of somewhere between 15 and 20 people. So this is a factory working 24 hours a day under London, building a tunnel. That is completely manufactured. If you then look at what we need to tie these running tunnels together, these are 7-metre diameter tunnels, to the passenger spaces, to the concourses, to the various escalator barrels and the rest of it, you don't have a machine as a tunnel boring machine, but you have to hand spray concrete. It's called sprayed concrete lining. When I was at Heathrow, then actually you had a pack of strong people holding nozzles. Today, these are people dressed as if they were space people, men and women, robotically operating robots. Now, that is a manufacturing process. So for the principal elements of Crossrail, we are actually manufacturing this. If you then look at how we introduce technology into the tunnels, then the running rail, of which there's 50 kilometres of running rail, the sleepers were built in a factory, the running rails built by the steel industry, handled by componentry specifically designed. In introducing the notion that our supply chains should look very carefully at the IP they carry and the innovation models they carry, actually we persuaded people to introduce robotics into our tunnels. And the joint venture of Alstom of Costain and the French Railway Engineering Group, for the first time, brought in robotics to the tunnels to do simple activities like drilling holes. But there happened to be 750,000 holes to drill. Now, there's a social side to this, because actually 28 people would otherwise drill their holes. This now needed a gang of 2. So I think there's plenty of opportunity on linear programs. Now, if I look at things like High Speed 2, then I'm quite sure these technologies will be taken forward. The opportunities will be sort of built upon. The question I ask, and I've just come back from Sri Lanka on a slight break, and every time I passed over a bridge in Sri Lanka, it was a government bridge. The handrails were identical, the components were identical, and actually that was British engineering in the 1880s. I very much hope that High Speed 2 will adopt a standardisation process to make sure those linear components that had the opportunity of being different through lack of client control, lack of direction of travel. I very much hope that we can finish the job off and make sure that every opportunity to standardise and to build off-site, creating high-value jobs in regions that haven't got it, is taken up. And I think that there is, we surprise ourselves when we talk to this commentary of how much of these things are actually delivered on-site. I want to give you one example, if I may. 2 platforms built on Crossrail. I don't know if you've heard this one before. One at Tottenham Court Road and one at Liverpool Street. Both identical platforms, both about 250 metres long, times 2, because there's a western and an eastern running tunnel, both built by the same supplier, Lang O'Rourke. And this gives you one answer as to why you don't mandate it. This has to be a value-driven equation. Actually, logistically, at Liverpool Street, we had a huge hole in the ground at Finsbury Circus. It used to be a bowling green in sort of, 1880. And we're going to put a bowling green back there, but it's now a huge hole in the ground. Logistically, we're able to put a huge, great big gantry crane over the top of it and lift huge, great big components down, weighing about 18 tonnes each. These components were the platforms, and they were built in Derby. On site, we had 7 people. The skills of those 7 people were not traditional concrete laying skills. These were people who understood logistics, who understood assembly, who understood manufacturing type techniques. They walked along large craneages that lifted great big components in place, and they put them in place against the digital model. In Derby, there were 27 people with high-value manufacturing jobs. 27,000 man-hours to build this platform. Go to Tottenham Court Road, exactly the same platform, 67 people on site, around 40 of whom were Eastern Europeans, and all of them were good construction workers. But because the logistics of Tottenham Court Road didn't allow us to put large components down, they were constrained to doing it traditionally. 67,000 man-hours against 27,000 man-hours. So you can just stand back and say, why are we doing this? It isn't just the pursuit because off-site is fun. It is because you solve a production issue, you solve a resources issue, and you inspire your supply chains to innovate and to research and develop the ways you do that. So I'd go back to one way of unlocking this is, yes, to have clients who are engaged and enlightened, but secondly, try to create an industry where it is worth their while to put some of the very thin margins that occur back into researching and to developing these techniques. And unless you create the business model that then allocates some of the win to the clients and some of the win to the supply chain and some of the win to the stakeholders are part of this, you'll never get this model to work. And I look at Skanska's old model. They were a huge exponent of helping me deliver an innovation program, asking Skanska to share their IP, and asking, because we match funded Skanska's Mike Putnam's own money, we match funded it to encourage people to find the solutions of getting this more productive way of doing it, of which off-site was a very, very valuable solution. So we have to break the current paradigm. If the public sector wants to procure for the lowest cost, we will never, ever get out of this loop of sort of hysteresis we're in. If the public sector wants to stand back and say, actually what we want is we want to create more value over the whole life of an asset, then they're going to do it by, I think, mandating a direction of travel, perhaps even a percentage of research and development in that programme, for which they'll have to match funds. On Crossrail, let me give you a very simple example. We said for every £3 million worth of work, we'd like you to put forward an apprentice, right? It was in some ways distorting the market. I asked myself, are we pleased that Crossrail has 1,000 apprentices right now? And can we not take that sort of behaviour and match it elsewhere? So the market responded by the client asking some pretty bold questions. So I do think we're now in a cycle where public sector clients in particular should put down some very strong indicators about a percentage of manufacture that they'd like off-site, by perhaps a suggestion that we will match some of the R&D you're going to put in, which is what the automotive and aerospace industry did, and certainly by saying that for a percentage of work we give you, we'd like you to employ an apprentice. And by asking these questions against a level playing field, the market will have to respond.
Question and then Lord
so I wonder if I could come
sorry
to my
if I was a
first
bit long.
question.
Go on.
No, I mean, to the first question, we had earlier a fragmented industry, 230,000 companies.
Yeah.
You came when you first started, you said this sector deal is fantastic.
Yeah.
We're prepared to accept that. Where will the capital come to back it?
So there are three elements of the sector deal. The first, which is the most difficult, requires no money. It requires leadership and behaviour change. It actually requires public sector clients to write something different down in their procurement strategies around the presumption for offsite, and I think over time we need to be able to measure this. We need to be able to work out that is the industry getting more productive by doing more manufacturing? Are we getting more highly skilled because we have a greater percentage as apprentices? So this isn't going to happen a week on Tuesday. This needs to come within the next thing the Leadership Council needs to do, plus Tony Meggs at the IPA, is to have this very, very simple but straightforward measurement process to understand. So the first element doesn't cost you any money. It's a behavioural change. The second element is already funded, and this comes with the Industry-Led Innovation Programme, and it's the Innovation Challenge Fund. It's about £170 million that's been committed to, and that presumes a match funding by the industry. So this is fairly small beer. Let's call this £400 million that didn't exist currently. This is a sector that invests less half of 1% in R&D. In order to make meaningful change, you need to divert that to somewhere around 3 or 4%. This is where automotive and aerospace has. So if we put 3 or 4% R&D money, by focusing the attention on a few things and doing it well, then we can begin to see critical mass. So that money has already been committed, but we haven't yet launched it. The third element is skills for the future. And at the moment, there are two ways in which you raise money for that. One is a levy through something called the CITB, the Construction Industry Training Board, which has had quite a rough ride recently because the industry has questioned the value that it provides. And quite rightly, because there needs now to be modernisation of CITB, which is happening. The second element is the government's apprentice levy. So some organisations will be required to pay at least 1% towards apprentices. Now, what we're saying is let's work out a better way of spending that 1%. So that is not new money. That's smarter ways of directing that 1% towards the skills we need for the future. So where does the capital come from? The first, around procuring for better value, is about understanding risk out there, understanding a total value outcome as opposed to a low-cost outcome, and representing that somehow in consistently procuring public sector programs in the future. That is probably the most difficult one we have to do. On one hand, it's sort of saying, well, am I going to distort the market by telling people what to do? And for a moment in time, I believe that we've got to be pretty bold in that. The central one, the exciting one, is about using the very limited resource we have sitting on people's balance sheets and government match funding it. That's where the £190 million is coming. And the third one is about money currently in the system being used better.
Thank you very much. Baroness Young, quick question, then Lord Borwick.
To take that just a tiny bit further, because you kind of think that if the economic case was powerful, that private sector clients would go for it. You know, there would be an indubitable case. But you seem to be saying, actually, this will only get legs and run if the public sector gets behind it. Is that absolutely the case?
Well, I think that it won't happen across the whole of the sector unless the public sector, who by country mile are the largest construction clients, actually understand the part they have to play. I mean, I explained my career. I haven't worked for very many people. One of the very informative times was working for BAA, the British Airports Authority in those days. We owned 7 airports in the UK and 3 internationally. I was there when Sir John Egan, who actually came from Land Rover Jaguar, who absolutely understood the manufacturing process and just gone through the crisis of the UK car industry. And unless that industry changed, it was obliterated. And he brought in the sense at BAA. He wrote a report called Rethinking Construction. It brought much of the technology and the process management from automotive into the industry. And so BAA, a private sector organisation, because there was a very powerful business case for itself, introduced a lot of standardisation, a lot of digitalisation, and a lot of off-site manufacture. Terminal 5, 85% of the mechanical and electrical services in Terminal 5 were built either on the Firth or Forth using oil rig technologies, or further downstream using off-site manufacturing technology. So there's an example of the private sector. There are many others. I mean, if you look at the regulated utility industry, the smart regulation can, I think, be a huge benefit in being able to pull supply chains and utility owners into delivering better performance, for instance, at the start of a 5-year quinquennium to the end. So there's a private companies responding, albeit to, I think, smart regulation. There's a good example. Private asset owners, for instance, BAA do. Private sector property companies. I think there's many great examples of British Land Securities, Stanhope, all previously have understood the value in getting their product to market, have worked with a limited number of suppliers, have invested vertically through the supply chain. So they take a team of players, they invest in those players, and they use them over and over again on projects. So where you have a consistency in the process and a consistency of the team who do it, then you can see really great examples of where value is brought to bear. But I do feel the public sector now has an opportunity to lead this, and I know when I came in, the big one-offs, the Olympics, the Terminal 5s, the Crossrails, and hopefully the high-speed 2s, they have an opportunity and they have a responsibility to work this sector at what I call an enterprise level. The problem is that if you have discrete investments called projects, then there's very little opportunity to work at an enterprise level in the same way that the automotive industry has worked over decades. They've improved manufacturing not because they've had one car to build, but because they've had 10 series of 100,000 cars to build. And things like the Construction Leadership Council, organisations like the Infrastructure Clients Group, and I'm very pleased that the small innovation programme we produced on Crossrail called Innovating has now become an industry platform called I3P. And all of these are sort of enablers and critical components of an industry that has not found it easy to work as one sort of hybrid model, enterprise model. It has only ever been encouraged to start and finish a project and then try and make 1% profit on the next one. And actually what we need to do is to work out the wings and the engines, the digital, the manufacturing and the through life, and whether you're a house builder or a public sector or a private contractor, all of those things are going to bring you long-term value.
Okay, Lord Warwick. Can we talk about the business models in the construction industry?
Yeah.
A big contractor works off remarkably little amount of capital and can have an enormous turnover. With off-site construction happening everywhere, is he going to need more capital than he had before? And does his cash flow change with this? It would seem to me that with a properly organised off-site construction, he would end up having to pay a lot earlier for the products that he actually sells to the client almost at the end of the process.
Well, look, I think this is a very good question, and I think in a sense this gets to the heart of it. Mike Chaldercott is a member of my Construction Leadership Council, and he looks at housing. The housing crisis, where actually the government are demanding 200,000 units a year, and actually at best over the last 10 years, I'm not quite sure, don't quote me on the figures, it's somewhere between 100 and 120,000. How do we actually develop another 80,000 houses per year? Some people feel that this is simply there are not enough bricklayers and there are not enough plasterers, and I'm sure that the lack of resources is part of that. Some people know that actually the housing developers are rather smarter than that. They're holding on to a land bank and they're waiting for the market to come back before they start investing. But if you look at the one or two organisations that are putting a huge amount of their own capital into the factory output to deliver houses, and you imagine you are that chief executive or managing director, and you're going to the bank saying, I'd like to go and borrow 50, 60, 70, 100 million pounds to deliver this output. And they say, what's the guarantee on your market? How can you make sure that this is a good capital asset to invest in over the next 10 years for which we, the banks, are exposed to? And they say, well, we can't because the housing market is cyclical. So actually the secret in getting the investment in the market, I think, is actually to understand from the supply point of view, how do you provide a regular pipeline against which you can invest and you can develop the sort of overhead that one single contractor alone is unable to deliver. So you have to take a slightly different market view on this, and I'm afraid this is one of the inhibitors. If I can quote Ray O'Rourke, inspirational, has invested personally tens of millions of pounds of his own money, and he is uniquely positioned in being able to deliver things off-site. He would love to invest in a housing factory and has all the skills and the capabilities, the technology and the leadership to do that. But is that going to be a good investment if actually the housing markets, for many reasons out of his control, sort of dry up? So my own personal view is that I think these overheads have to be sort of owned probably by a cooperative, I don't know, more than one single unique organisation. Or the government have to understand the value of a consistent pipeline. And if you can get, for instance, I have to say I'm disappointed that my next job isn't starting a week on Monday, and it's called Crossrail 2. We have all the machinery, all the expertise, all the momentum built up in this sector, but all of a sudden, poof, we stop. All of those technologies, all the resources are now going to be dispersed elsewhere, some internationally. If Crossrail 2 had a pipeline, and forgive me, this is difficult, national infrastructure programs had a pipeline that was consistent and was optimised, then I think two things would happen within the sector. One is they'd feel less exposed to investing their capital in the equipment you need to keep these things going, and secondly, they'd have a resource platform that wasn't cyclical and imported, a resource platform again owned by the organisations that were delivering that capital outcome.
But isn't it inevitable in the house building market, particularly, that it is very starting and stopping and stuttering because of the planning system, because of so many people wanting to be involved in the details of the house and whether or not houses are built in that particular area? Doesn't it therefore suggest that if it's hard in the infrastructure trade to achieve this consistently, it's going to be nearly impossible in the housing?
Well, I think all of these are constraints, which is why Mike Trollocott has actually not looked at trying to anticipate the technologies. He's saying, what is the circumstances around which people would invest in that capacity? And the circumstances are consistency of pipeline, access to finance, and some sort of consistent behaviour around housing authorities or public sector housing or even private sector housing, specifying what that house should be able to do over its life cycle. And with a relatively small amount of recalibration of these things, I think one would be surprised by the opportunity that it was exposed.
Do you have any idea about the quantum of money that would be required for this extra capital to transform the housing industry?
I don't, but I mean, we could perhaps take within the Construction Leadership Council and do some sort of equation around it. Again, consistency of pipeline. It's a very interesting question. Does that cost you any money? Yes, because house builders would not traditionally expose themselves to a market that for which house prices were reducing, for which there wasn't an immediate uptake of it. And I guess they do that because it is in their economic interest not to be exposed to that shortfall. So that there must somewhere be a cost to this, but it would be an interesting piece of work to do.
Lord Hunt.
You began by comparing aerospace wings and engines. As you know, in aerospace you have Rolls-Royce with a golden share, and you have the aerospace without a golden share, and progressively maybe we're no longer a dominant partner of Airbus. What's going to happen? I mean, it does. Rolls-Royce is a good example, where there's very strong UK investment by the government. It works. But the car industry is largely owned by foreign companies. So do you sort of see that massive national investment is what's required?
And I think it is always interesting to talk about the mechanics of offsite, but I mean, understanding the circumstances where that happens naturally as a consequence of the market is what we should be talking about. Rolls-Royce, if you go to the Advanced Manufacturing Centre at Coventry, one of the 7 units that operates one of the government catapults around manufacturing, then you'll see that Rolls-Royce's logo is in probably 6-foot-high letters. You'll also see that they are not alone. And even though Rolls-Royce holds the huge international respect, the international markets and the market share that it does, it realises that it can only operate if the industry around it operates at an enterprise level. And that is why you've got probably 50 or 60 different logos sitting around Rolls-Royce representing their supply chain, all trying to find that collaborative answer together. That is why the government has decided that if you match fund this then the industry will respond in kind. And the consequence of that is still having, whether it's golden or not golden, a share in the global market, is very focused, high-value resources sitting around an industry that is high in R&D, that is easily exportable, but requires, I'm sure, the sort of support that all other international aero engine manufacturers have, this sort of collaborative enterprise model where governments match fund. So these industries do not operate on their own, in the same way that I think the pursuit of battery or pursuit of driverless technologies isn't going to come from Jaguar Land Rover or Ford or whoever our wonderful foreign-owned car operators are who still hold the technology. It will not be done unless the sector operates at an enterprise platform, and that's why I think the Construction Leadership Council agenda is very important, because it's beginning to say what are the 3 prerequisites we need to become more productive, more international, more high-value skills-oriented, more exportable. It is the digitalisation of the front end to understand the outcomes. It is the manufacturing element, of which off-site is one of them, and it's the through-line performance through the sort of digitalisation of assets. And if I can just say, you have the most phenomenal project ahead of you in this Palace of Westminster. Yeah. There are going to be several billion pounds spent on this, and this is a fantastic opportunity to almost hold the international market of undoing and then doing together these buildings. Unless you absolutely understand, almost shift by shift, what you're going to do by digitalising this complex building. Behind some walls there's probably 350-year-old plaster and horsehair, and beside other walls there are complex componentries, mechanical, electrical. Unless you completely digitalise that and have the opportunity to do a lot of this work in factories around the country, for which you will be an exemplar role model, then this will be very complex indeed. And of course the length of time that you're debating, whether you stay in the chamber or go out of the chamber, these are all difficult inconveniences. And the only way you can minimise that is by actually absolutely understanding the outcome, the process of politics when you get your new Parliament building, and the process of delivering that, as much of which must be done off-site as possible.
Lord Mayor.
In the earlier session, we heard evidence about this issue about the government, 5 departments saying they will adopt a presumption in favour of off-site manufacture, off-site construction, by 2019. Yeah. Where it represents best value for money. Yeah. What do you think the government needs to do to really advance that case? Because it's sort of saying presumption in favour of off-site manufacture, but it doesn't feel like a really big push. It's not mandating. What are your views about that?
Well, I would say 2 or 3 questions have come up, all of which are relevant here. One of which is around the business case that absolutely makes it compelling that the right way of delivering this particular asset is to introduce manufacturing, and the presumption is off-site manufacturing. We need, over the next generation of asset development, to be able to measure the outcome of that. And I think that this will really accelerate. At the moment, we should rely probably on the market leaders. But over the next course, the next half generation, we need to be able to prove convincingly that those organisations and those supply chains that deliver efficiencies on site, and that could be through off-site manufacturing or taking a smart logistics process or robotics process, those organisations are able to have the opportunity to either make more profit or share the savings. And if you look at housing in particular, with a very small local architect who's just invested in off-site manufacture for wooden-based houses, he thinks he can take 35-40% time off. It takes him just weeks to put up a house once he's out of the ground, and he's pretty close to understanding the percentage cost reduction. And he has to figure out how much he retains himself and how much he gives back to the market. But I think, Lord Mayor, that this needs to be a combination of taking the benchmarked examples and breaking them down in the different components to prove the value equation, is setting up a long-term set of sort of key performance indicators across the industry. So let's say rather than measuring, as was post-Egan and Rethink Construction, cost, profit, and time to market. Time to market is important, but let's say we start to measure this sector's ability to export, this sector's ability to off-site manufacture, the sector's ability to take up a percentage of apprentices, and the sector's ability to invest in research and development. These are very different key performance indicators. These are indicating smart, modern sectors rather than ones that have no opportunity of investing in themselves. So I think number one is the public sector have to ask the right questions. Number two is they have to illustrate this on an annual basis by exemplar programs that are leading the way. And number three, the message the market has to follow by having a set of KPIs that makes it very difficult for supply chains in the future, not because otherwise they'd go out of business, to follow a more profit-driven, a more value-driven outcome, which incidentally is going to give them superior profits.
And do you think that all that leads to a change in mindset about procurement?
I do, because that's why I said that I think the most difficult, we've been back, haven't we, over many years talking about the value of the work that you've done at Cambridge. On its own, a smart sensor providing valued information is worth nothing unless that information can be locked into a life cycle model or can be locked into a delivery model. And unless the client asks the right questions, he'll never get that. So, I do think that the most difficult thing around public sector procurement, if I look at the letter that was written to me by Chris Grayling, Secretary of State for Transport, absolutely supported what we're doing on the CLC. If I look at the Department of Justice around their prison programme, absolute support. There's an energy around education, and I think to health. But so what you're beginning to get now, and I think the IPA, used to be a brand of a beer. What does IPA stand for now?
Infrastructure Project Authority.
Thank you. Infrastructure Project. We're beginning to get, I think, an organisation and realisation that a set of processes up at IPA level and change programs in each individual government department that are consistent with this CLC sector deal, these are all pushing the barge in the same direction. And I actually think that this is a very exciting opportunity, but it does start with an alignment of each of the different spending departments, understanding the same type of question that you need for the supply chain, which is very diverse, to give you the same market response. And the problem is we heard differently, 3 different roofs going on 3 identical hospitals. Well, that's because there's lots of variation in how the questions are asked. I think if we can begin to get some consistency in how these questions are asked, then the market will begin to understand at an enterprise level there's one more efficient way of producing. There'll never be a single set of solutions, but the direction of travel will be towards buildings that has a higher percentage manufactured, that has a higher percentage built by robots, there's a higher percentage that is built off-site, and therefore has a much, much better opportunity beginning to export not buckets of concrete, but expertise as to how you create this. And I'm very pleased to say that Crossrail International is something that Secretary of State for Transport, Chris Grayling, has supported. And what is of interest to international markets is not how to physically do the work, but how to bring this to market, how to set up apprentice programs, how to set up off-site manufacturing in the environment within which you do this. So there's an interest. There's a really, really inquisitive interest as to how you share some of these technologies.
My questions are to do with further to do with skills that you've been discussing. Yeah. And the question is, what types of skills are needed to facilitate a move to off-site manufacture? I mean, you've told us a lot of marvellous examples that in your work on the tunnel, the Crossrail. How do these go to differ from traditional skills, and what organisations will be responsible?
Yeah. Well, skills for the future is a very, very important strand within the CLC Construction Leadership Council, and it's very interesting that if we demand more of the traditional skills, we've sort of completely missed the point. I think it's very interesting. I've forgotten what the lady was called sitting here, but actually clients are important. You know, we say skills, and we probably think of traditional sort of apprentice-type skills, skilled and semi-skilled, skilled trades. Actually, skills of a civil servant who is presented with a procurement problem and a risk profile needs to understand, and I'm delighted to say that the Syed Business School, I think, is providing some sort of skills opportunity for civil servants, not just to be good at delivering policy, but also to be good at understanding how you manage portfolios of risk. You can look at it at one set. I think clienthood skills, in again understanding the risk profile and understand the different ranges of procurement opportunity you have. We need to attract in this sector the sort of skills that go to Google and Amazon. The digitalisation of those sectors has been enormously successful and progressive. We need those skills to be attracted by our universities, and I think, Robert, from a sort of a university perspective, yes, we need to understand how graduates are trained in the... I went back to Southampton University the other day. There was still the same machine that bent a beam today that there was 35 years ago. We need to do that, but it needs to occupy slightly less of the curriculum. So there's the clienthood skills, the civil servant skills, the graduate skills. Don't in any way think that any of those people are let off the hook. And then when you go down into the trades, in this building you're going to need stonemasons, and I happen to know that on your critical path is getting enough stonemasons because there's a lot of stonemasonry. In a housing site, I would expect over a 10-year period for you to have a less proportion of bricklayers and more percentage of people who understand manufacturing skills back in the manufacturing departments. Less plasterers, because actually your walls are going to be pre-assembled in pre-packs again in factories. So, when I look at those 7 people on site as opposed to the 67 people at Tottenham Court Road, those 67 people were bar benders putting steel in reinforced concrete, were shutterers, were support labourers with wheelbarrows and brushes. It was skilled and semi-skilled. Actually, the 7 people we had were people who operated robotics, who operated logistic equipment, and who operated just-in-time models. So there needs to be I'll use this word, revolutionary shift in understanding. And part of what we within the sector deal are doing is trying to identify through something called Trailblazer. If you have Trailblazer, then you can draw some of the 0.5% money down from your apprentice levy and you can get modern apprentices from it. And so we need to identify through Trailblazers what those skills are, probably starting from the top and going right the way through a vertical section of the supply chain. And I don't kid you, but actually people who can mend robots, because brick walls in future will be built by robots, and it won't be the lack of skip holders, it'll be the people who repair the robots. So let's think really radically about what we need for this sector, how to revolutionise actually what we do at best to world-class standards. I've been around the world a lot. There are very few programs in Asia or in the Middle East or in America that haven't got a British architect or a British engineer. Let's not, we are world-class at this stuff, and where we have exemplar programs, this is the envy of the world. What we have to do is to be positive about this sector deal, to back it, to sort of do whatever we've got to do to get it launched, and then to really, I think, rely on the industry in response to subtly different procurement questions and allow the market to be able to cause the adjustment that we so badly need right now.
Dr. Valens.
Earlier on you said that a major block on progress in the housing market was its cyclicality.
Yeah.
One reason or another. I mean, does the sector deal in any way try to handle that problem? Are you trying to deal with the cyclicality? I mean, there are ways of dealing with cyclicality. There are other cyclical industries. You can go right back to the milk marketing board, if you like, whatever. I mean, are there governmental ways that you're trying to deal with this, or how to take the risk out of it, or spread it in a more fair way?
We have to draw a line around those things that we are responsible for, those things we're accountable for. But I'm neither responsible or accountable for Brexit, for market economic fluctuations, nor the fluctuation in housing market. I think what we're trying to do is to point the sort of the mirror back, saying actually, if you didn't think it was a significant part of the future model, then the cyclicality is one of the fundamental reasons why the capital is not going into the capability of putting in manufacturing components. So The answer is no. We're not accountable, or we're not responsible, or we're not trying to change the cyclicality. It's because of market forces, because of land ownership, because of planning, as well as resources. But what I think we need to do, and Mark Farmer, who wrote a report with an awful title called, I think, Survive or Die, pointed out that unless we took up some of these important themes, we should not estimate or anticipate huge, fundamental, sustainable change within the sector. And in some way, it is never going to be perfect. There will never, ever be a Crossrail 2 or Crossrail 3 or High Speed 2 that completely follows it. But there needs to be the capacity in the industry and the pipeline in the industry to make it a first choice, to make house building one that attracts not people who just traditionally build bricks, who are very important, but also attract people because there's a technological, there's a design, and there's a market challenge to it. And I think that at that sense, market share and market cyclicality is a very, very important instrument.
No, I buy off that, but I come back to the earlier question, and that is, if cyclicality is such a significant block, then is there anything that you can do about it, and who should be doing it, and how? If it isn't you, it's government departments.
Well, I've heard a political aspiration of 200,000 houses built every year. That seems to be a level outcome, which must mean that with that, at some point, comes a set of tools that creates the opportunity to level out the cyclicality. But I don't, with respect, think it's the construction sector's accountability to do more than point out why investment isn't being put in. You've got organisations like L&G, Legal and General. Legal and General are pension fund managers. Why is it that they are investing in pre-packed housing markets? Because actually a lot of the long-term stable monetisation they're getting is from the investment in housing and the income that it gives. Someone actually said ownership is very important. It's really interesting. If you look at Bouygues, or you look at Vinci from France, or you look at Ferrovial from Spain, why is it that their balance sheets are 10 times bigger than any UK contractor? It is because they own long-term assets. They don't make much money out of building toll roads or toll bridges or car parks, but they gain a market stability and a balance sheet strength by holding an asset that is worth a monetisation over its entire life cycle. Actually, PFI gave the opportunity for the UK contracted infrastructure market to gain a critical mass in its balance sheet. If actually, and I know I'm diversifying here, if Curation had had a balance sheet the same size as Skanska did, or Bouygues or Vinci had, I doubt whether the adjustments they had to make in their cash would have meant that they were... there is a value in having balance sheets that allow you to invest in research and development, in take risks over a life cycle, and then have a monetisation that allows the market to be able to support you and capitalise you at those times of leanness. Our own industry, because this sector has been designed this way over many decades by both private and public sector, has ended up too small and too vulnerable to market changes. And that's one of the reasons why the housing market and the UK construction industry cannot bridge some of these cyclical events.
Lord Mayor, and go on to your question.
And that leads me to ask about R&D, that you just mentioned. And you said earlier that the very thin margins of our construction industry, it's quite hard to imagine the private sector putting money into R&D, and there is a big difference between those large French companies and Spanish companies that you mentioned. Do you see that as an intractable problem in the UK? That the likelihood of getting the private construction sector putting a lot more money into R&D is quite low?
Yeah. Well, I spoke the other day to the ex-chief executive of 3M, the organisation that's famous for post-it stickers. But if you look at the endless revolution and innovation that they have delivered, and I asked, what is the critical mass around an organisation or a a part of a sector that allows it to grow disproportionately. And he said that you need to reach this 3 or 4% of turnover investment. So how do you mimic that in this sector, which traditionally invests less than 0.5%? You do it by having 1 or 2 clients like Crossrail who get the ball rolling, who insist that their supply chain, if they're going to be part of the party, match fund that. So we're talking about very low levels of funding. And I asked, I think, Scansgrove over the duration of our programme to put in £50,000, which Crossrail matched. So we had a pot of the low millions of pounds. But that low millions of pounds created an environment where it was okay to pass different ideas around. And actually people became rather excited about the reward and recognition they got for something that was done very well in Tottenham Court Road on a Friday, suddenly being the way of doing things at Liverpool Street next Monday. There was a way of this good news jamming. If I think this sector deal, for which there's a limited amount of money, let's say £190 million, double that, match fund that, and that the organisations that collaborate around the sector deal look at focusing the limited amount of money in 3 or 4 areas, and we're suggesting digital, manufacturing and through-life performance. If we can get a portfolio of programmes, in the same way that automotive and aerospace did, to be able to focus this limited resource in these areas that actually manifested itself in 2, 3 or 4% R&D, then I think you could begin very quickly, I hope very quickly, this is the thesis, you can very quickly get critical mass in those certain areas. And it is through those benchmark programmes, through consistent application of the right questions through procurement, and through, I think, charts over a 5-year programme as to where the best value is spent, this is how you're going to get this sector believing that. Focus on R&D is going to come up with a long-term value, a long-term sustained solution, long-term value that is both good for our home market, it is good for our local job market, and it is exportable. And the sector deal is going to be asking the private sector to put in 250 million. Well, the sector deal, so the I3P, which is this industry-led innovation model, chaired in those days, still chaired by Andy Mitchell, who's the current chief executive of Thames Tideway, was asked to go and do a study as to what money existed on people's balance sheets for R&D. He said, I'm quoting this half of 1%. This money we know is out there. What we have to do is we have to be able to bring together pools of expertise around projects for which they are prepared to invest, and government will match fund. And if these are well-chosen projects, some of which should certainly be around the long-term life asset of infrastructure, then I think private companies, public sector spending departments will realise that this is long-term value, and that the procurement model should accommodate this in their next round of infrastructure investment.
Yes.
A cousin of mine, I'd like to mention my brother, he wrote a book on economics. He was the BBC economics correspondent. So I read his book and I said, there's something wrong with this book. I like to do that. And he said it's got no reference to cyclical behaviour of economies. But that is it's different economists have different views about this. So I wonder whether you think you could give them a hint for what have we learned from recent events in economics that governments, as it were, should take into account.
I mean, all I would say is that having the fantastic opportunity to run Crossrail, I'm also incidentally just about to join the board of High Speed 2. What is the big why of Crossrail? Why have we done it? It's because London, currently at 8.6 million, predicted by 2030 to be 10 million, if it is to remain a capital city, needs long-term investment. This long-term investment far outbridges political cycles, and to a very large extent far outbridges economic cycles. Unless one understands the real long-term value of economic infrastructure, we will not prepare UK PLC to have the connectivity and the transferability that it needs, not for this decade or the next decade, for the next 50, 100 years. If you look at the wisdom of the people around this room, and the reason why London is a capital city is because people like Basildette in 1863 built a sewage system to last for 100 years. People like Brunel built economic infrastructure not for a return in 3 years or a market return the next quarter. And politicians must understand this economics of infrastructure and the opportunity and ability it brings for the value of a nation. And until we, in a sense, put some of this into a special case, we'll never ever make the long-term decisions in order to, develop and to enhance our prosperity in the future. Apologies. I mean, I'm not trying to knock economics, but political and economic cycles are too short-term.
That note, Mr. Wolstenholme, thank you very much indeed for coming today to help us. It's been an enormous help, and you are a fantastic witness to talk to.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.